The title of this video might seem kind of dumb, but bear with me. Whenever I make my scenes, I tend to start by drawing in grayscale. Overall, I think this process kind of just makes sense. That way you can get your art into the scene quicker to see if it works. And you can also start seeing if the shapes work well, without being affected by all the colors on the screen. I might throw a colored asset or two in there, but by and large I don't add any colors. But as soon as I think it starts looking good, I go back to my assets, add that color, play around with the adjustments until I think it looks right, then I toss everything back into the scene until I have something that I like. But if you have ever used particle effects before, you generally don't do this. What you do is you draw a white blob, or in a different shape for that matter, and then you adjust the colors or the gradient directly in your engine. You don't ever color the particle itself. That way you can use the same particle, but let the engine change the color really quickly depending on the scene. You can also change the color depending on how long the particle has existed. So the particle might start out invisible, slowly fade into blue, then as it starts to age, it shifts into red, until it eventually fades out and becomes invisible again. Now, while doing some light reading, I encountered this article about Dead Cells, and they apparently kept their background assets in grayscale. So like these assets right here are actually grayscale, and then they're colored using a gradient texture. So the engine basically says turn in a dark gray color to a purple blue tint, and then in a lighter gray into teal. And as you can see, it looks good. So the underlying asset is still gray, but the engine tells the graphics card to reinterpret it before it shows us on screen. Why would you do this? Well, let's test it out. We take this scene, we add some values, and now we have a completely gray scene, but with the values that we want. Now if we add a gradient shader to an asset like this bush, and adjust it so that the dark gray is a dark green, and the lighter gray goes towards a yellowish green, now the asset gets reinterpreted, and now looks like this. And well, it doesn't look that bad. If I do this for all the assets in the scene, we get this. Now we can just go into the engine, readjust the color of the bush, and we get a different vibe in the scene without having to change the underlying asset. This is the argument they put forth in the article. Any change you want to make is quick to make. But what is the downside? Well, let's see what happens if I make an identical scene, but now I color every asset myself on the iPad, without any gradient texture. And now if we start this scene and compare the two, well, they look a bit different, but also kind of similar. There isn't any obvious quality difference, but we do see some things. When I draw an asset like this sword, I can color the metal gray and the handle red, and it just works. But if I add a gradient shader to this sword, now I can't really pick out just the handle and make it red. The entire asset will be colored in one single color. So every material I add in the game will basically need to have its own shader and its own gradient. The second thing we can see is kind of a weird one. When I color each of these stone blocks, I basically go into the asset and pick a rough color of what I want, and then I finish the asset. Then I go to the next asset and redo that same process. And now when we see in game, the color of each asset don't really match that much. They're all a bit different. If we compare that to the gradient scene, since they're all using the same gradient texture, they all match perfectly. Now personally, I actually kinda like the fact that each asset becomes a bit unique. It makes the scene look less artificial, as if these just happen to be different rock types. There is another small downside, which won't affect every artist. If you draw an asset like this rock, and you place grass beneath it, in reality, ambient light would reflect back up on the underside of this rock here, and shade it kind of green. It wouldn't really look like this. And some fancy artists like adding this stuff because it generally makes your art look better. With a gradient texture, you can't really do this. Just like with the red handle, any shading that you do will have to be simple. You can't really mix colors the way I did in my previous video. So perhaps we should really use it for what it's meant to be used for. If we take all the background elements and just remove the line art and remove the details, and make the background simple, now we have a foreground colored by me and a background using a gradient. And I personally think it looks great. Significantly better than the scene where I colored everything myself. But we do have versatility here, with the ability to change the colors in the engine. But Motion Twin probably didn't do what I just did. You see, I put a gradient shader on individual assets in order to shift the color of that individual asset. But in Dead Cells, it's significantly more likely that they added a canvas shader of sorts that shifts the gradient of every single background asset at once. If I was to do this, it would mean that every single background asset is under the same gradient. This bush and this tree will use the exact same gradient texture. And so if I make the tree brown, the bush will have to be brown as well. The biggest reason for doing it this way in a normal situation is probably performance. Having one instance of a shader redo the background is quite different from having individual shaders on each asset. Blur shaders work the same. Blurring your entire background at once doesn't affect performance that much. But blurring individual foreground assets, not as fun. Now, I personally haven't noticed any considerable dip in performance from using shaders on individual assets in this scene. But I've also made a fairly small sequence, and I don't know how well it would scale. But okay, now we have a situation just like in Dead Cells. I can shift the background in the engine without having to touch the asset, which would also mean that you could do a day-night scene or have different colors to the same asset in different scenes. The asset becomes more versatile, kind of, because you might be noticing one thing in a situation like this. The background looks kind of disjointed from the foreground, as if they don't really belong to the same universe. In part, this could be due to the lack of line art, but also the colors look disjointed. So does this mean that you have to redo all your foreground assets to match? Well, not necessarily. You could do that, or you could use post-processing effects and color balance your entire scene. Now if you make it a bit warmer, it looks fine. And now if we want to make it a night scene, we have to color balance the entire scene again and make it colder. And it technically works. Now if you don't like the idea of this, individual shaders on individual assets might actually work. And if you don't want to worry about performance, you could obviously just color each asset using a gradient in your drawing software. I'm personally not going to be using it like this. However, I am likely going to be using it in a situation like this, where the assets in the furthest back are actually grey, but I'll also have one or two assets that are colored by me. To me, it's a perfect mix of versatility, readability, and aesthetics, and it follows a good artistic principle. Don't add details to things that aren't important elements. But I actually haven't shown you what I think the biggest strength of this might be. What if you aren't doing hand-drawn? After all, Dead Cells is pixel art. Well, let's see. Now mind you, I'm not a pixel artist, and I only spent an hour or two to throw this together. But hopefully it's enough to showcase my point. This scene here has fairly low bit depth. I only use something like 6 different grays. Now if I color this scene, I can actually easily target each individual color. I can make the flower petal white and the vine green, even if they belong to the same asset. Actually, I could color the entire scene at once, as long as they don't use the exact same gray. That is, I don't even need to use a linear gradient like this. I can target each individual color, and in this scenario, I can change the entire scene in a matter of seconds. I don't really have the same drawbacks as I had with hand-drawn, and I don't even have to worry about performance. I think if you're doing a game like Haiku or Kunai, making your entire game in gray would probably work quite well. That way you could focus on the values. Same thing would probably apply to a hand-drawn style in a similar fashion to Hue. Gradient shaders seem like a great idea for simple styles. But if you're going for an origin style type of game, it probably would only make sense for like 1 or 2 assets, like particles, not much else. But a style like Cheapo, this type of pixel art, or my style for that matter, yeah, it could work. I will say that the problem I personally felt when drawing the pixel art scene is that I had trouble imagining if it would look good when it was all in grayscale. It's difficult imagining that this is a vine when it's all in a low resolution gray. But this could just be a problem related to the fact that I haven't really done pixel art before. And you could technically draw your pixel art in color and just recolor it using a shader anyway. With my hand-drawn scene, I tried using a gradient shader on an already colored asset, and it sometimes looked fine and other times not. But this problem wouldn't really exist with pixel art. All of this to say, should your game art be gray? Maybe. Oh, and feel free to read the article on Game Developer. It's a good read. Thanks for watching. Bye.